The fluorescent lights of the Pinehurst Heights Community Center conference room cast a sterile, unflattering glare on the proceedings, buzzing with the quiet hum of institutional indifference. It was the third Tuesday of the month, which meant the Architectural Control Committee was in session. For most of the 20-odd residents seated in the uncomfortable folding chairs, it was a civic duty performed with the enthusiasm of a root canal. For Margaret Whitfield, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of community aesthetics, it was theater, and she was the star. Tonight's opening act was a flustered CPA named Arthur Henderson, who stood before the long table like a man on trial for a capital crime. His offense, staining his new privacy fence with a shade of cedar that was, in Margaret's measured opinion, too vibrant and emotionally disruptive to the neighborhood's earth-tone harmony. The sample chip was approved. "Margaret," Arthur pleaded, his voice thin, "it's autumn oak. It's from the pre-approved palette." Margaret, seated at the center of the five-person committee, adjusted the silk scarf knotted at her throat. She was a woman sculpted by years of low-impact aerobics and high-impact disapproval, her blonde hair locked in a helmet of hairspray that could likely withstand a Category 3 hurricane. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on the binder in front of her. The chip was approved. Arthur, the final application, however, exhibits a gloss level inconsistent with the matte finish specified in Rule 7.14 subsection B. It reflects the afternoon sun with an intensity that could be considered a nuisance under the Nuisance and Annoyances Clause. Two of her committee members, a retired insurance salesman and a woman whose primary qualification seemed to be her unwavering sycophancy, nodded in grave agreement. The other two stared blankly at their notes, their faces masks of practiced neutrality. One of them was Evelyn Rhodes, the long-serving board secretary, a woman in her late 70s who looked perpetually weary. "It's fence stain," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "Who measures the gloss level of fence stain?" "We do." "Arthur," Margaret said, her tone a chilling blend of condescension and pity. "That is why we are here. To maintain the standards that protect our property values." She looked to her left, then her right, all in favor of upholding the violation and requiring Mr. Henderson to restain his fence with an approved matte finish within 30 days. 4 hands went up. Evelyn's rose a moment later, slow and reluctant. The gavel, a comically oversized wooden mallet Margaret had purchased with HOA funds, fell with a sharp crack. Motion carries. Next on the agenda, Case 2023-47, 814T Oakmont Drive, Mr. Trevor Mackenzie. That was me. I rose from my seat in the back row and walked to the podium, placing my own slim binder on the lectern. I felt the familiar weight of 20 pairs of eyes on me, a mixture of curiosity and preemptive sympathy. I was the new guy, the quiet man who had moved in 6 months ago, the man with the unapproved greenhouse. "Good evening, committee members," I began, my voice even and calm. I had spent 15 years in courtrooms and deposition meetings. The performative formality of this hearing was second nature. "My name is Trevor Mackenzie. I am here to appeal the violation notice regarding the construction of a horticultural structure on my property." I laid out my case with quiet precision. I presented the blueprints, which showed the structure was well under the maximum square footage for an accessory building. I showed them the permit from the city building department. I presented photographs of the structure itself, an elegant, understated greenhouse of black aluminum and tempered glass, nestled discreetly behind a row of mature arborvitae. "As you can see," I continued, "the structure is not visible from the street, and its placement adheres to all setback requirements outlined in the CC&Rs. The materials are of high quality, and the design is in keeping with the modern aesthetic of my home." Margaret let me finish. A faint, predatory smile playing on her lips. She didn't look at my documents. Her gaze was fixed on me, analytical and cold. "Mr. Mackenzie, your presentation is very thorough. You've certainly done your homework, but you're overlooking the most critical document of all the community's governing covenants, specifically CC&Rs. Section 8.4.2, which requires prior written approval from this committee for any and all architectural modifications." "I understand that, Ms. Whitfield," I replied politely. "My application for approval was submitted 8 weeks ago, having received no response, and, with the city permit about to expire, I proceeded with construction, as is common practice when a committee fails to act within the 60-day review period stipulated in the bylaws." Her smile tightened. "We are a volunteer committee, Mr. Mackenzie. We operate on our own schedule. Your interpretation of the bylaws is aggressive and incorrect." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a confidential, almost conspiratorial tone that carried through the silent room. "The real issue here isn't the timing. It's the purpose and placement of the structure. Tell me, what is the exact height of this greenhouse?" 11 feet, 4 inches at its peak," I answered. 11 feet, 4 inches, she repeated slowly, as if the number itself were an obscenity. She turned to the committee. "A structure of that height, located at the rear of the property, could potentially interfere with the Pinehurst Heights View Corridor easement." A murmur went through the room. The View Corridor easement was a piece of Pinehurst Heights lore, an obscure clause from the original development plan designed to protect the panoramic views for the handful of premium homes on the ridge. My home was at the bottom of the slope. "My property survey makes no mention of my lot being burdened by such an easement," I stated calmly. "An oversight by your title company." "Perhaps," Margaret said with a dismissive wave. "But the master plat map is quite clear. The committee's preliminary finding is that your structure constitutes a violation of this long-standing community protection." She didn't ask for a discussion. She didn't poll the members for their thoughts. She simply declared it. "Your appeal is denied. You have 30 days to remove the structure. Failure to comply will result in the levying of fines, beginning at $100 per day." She banged the gavel. Meeting adjourned. The social humiliation was swift and absolute. As people filed out, they avoided my eyes. I was no longer just the new guy. I was a problem, a rule breaker, a threat to their sacred views and property values. I stood alone at the podium, packing my binder. Margaret Whitfield walked past me, pausing just long enough to lean in and whisper, her voice laced with triumph. "Welcome to Pinehurst Heights, Mr. Mackenzie. We have standards here." My life in Pinehurst Heights wasn't supposed to involve public shamings and arcane property disputes. It was supposed to be quiet. I'd bought the house on Oakmont Drive for one reason: my mother, Eleanor. After a fall and a frighteningly long hospital stay, she could no longer live alone in her sprawling old house 2 states away. Pinehurst Heights was close to the best specialists, and the single-story layout of the home was perfect for her limited mobility. I am, by nature and by trade, a man who prefers to remain in the background. My title is Assistant Attorney General for the state, assigned to the Special Investigations Division. My days are spent untangling complex webs of white-collar crime, corporate fraud, and public corruption. It's meticulous, draining work that requires a deep well of patience and an almost monastic devotion to procedural detail. When I come home, I want peace. The last thing I ever wanted was to advertise my profession in a neighborhood full of doctors, executives, and entrepreneurs. I was content to be known simply as Trevor, the quiet fellow who worked for the state. The greenhouse was for Eleanor, her passion, the one thing that had survived the creeping fog of age and infirmity. Was her collection of bonsai trees. For decades, she had nurtured them, coaxing miniature maples into gnarled, ancient forms and wiring juniper branches into living sculptures. They were her art and her meditation, but they were delicate things, requiring precise conditions of light and humidity that the dry indoor air of the house couldn't provide. So, I built her a sanctuary, a small, perfect glass house where she could sit for hours, surrounded by her tiny, beautiful trees. The effect on her was immediate and profound. The listlessness that had clung to her since the fall began to lift. Her eyes regained a spark of their old fire. That greenhouse wasn't just a structure of aluminum and glass. It was therapy. It was a reason for her to get up in the morning. It was, in a very real sense, her life. And Margaret Whitfield wanted me to tear it down. My first brush with Margaret had been innocuous. A welcome basket delivered a week after I moved in. It contained a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling cider, a single, flavorless rice cake, and a 3-inch thick binder emblazoned with the Pinehurst Heights logo. The covenants, conditions and restrictions, the CC&Rs, the community Bible. "We're so glad to have you," she'd said, her smile as bright and hard as polished linoleum. "I'm Margaret Whitfield, the HOA president. I'm also the top-selling agent with Pinehurst Realty for 5 years running. I pride myself on protecting the investment we've all made in this wonderful community." I later learned that protecting the investment was her justification for a reign of micromanagerial terror. She patrolled the neighborhood daily in a golf cart with Community Excellence Director stenciled on the side, a clipboard perpetually affixed to the steering wheel. She was the author of a weekly HOA newsletter filled with passive-aggressive reminders about trash can placement and shrill condemnations of unapproved seasonal decor. My quiet, low-profile existence made me an immediate object of suspicion. I didn't host barbecues. I didn't join the neighborhood book club. I worked long, irregular hours. To Margaret, my privacy was an affront. My refusal to engage was a silent rebellion. The greenhouse was simply the casus belli she had been waiting for. I spent that evening after the hearing in my home office, the thick binder of CC&Rs open on my desk. The fluorescent highlighter in my hand felt as familiar as a weapon. I read through the dense legalese, the labyrinthine clauses and subclauses. My eyes kept returning to the section Margaret had cited, RAR 8.4.2, Architectural Modifications. It was standard boilerplate, present in almost every HOA document in the country. But as I cross-referenced it with the bylaws, I found the 60-day review period I had mentioned. Her claim that they could operate on their own schedule was a bald-faced lie. This wasn't about a rule. This was about her. She had targeted me. The question was why. A week later, the letter arrived. Not in the regular mail, but via certified mail, requiring a signature. The green slip in my mailbox felt like a summons. I signed for it, the postman giving me a look of practiced neutrality that I recognized from process servers. The envelope was from the HOA's management company, a third-party firm that handled the administrative grunt work. But the prose inside was pure Margaret. It was a formal violation notice, a cold, brutally efficient document that laid out my transgressions in numbered paragraphs. It cited the committee's decision, the specific covenants I had allegedly violated, including the mysterious view corridor easement, and reiterated the demand remove the unapproved structure within 30 days. The daily fine of $100 would commence on day 31. I put the letter on the kitchen counter and went to check on my mother. She was in the greenhouse, a small pair of shears in her hand, delicately pruning the new growth on a dwarf pine. A contented, focused smile was on her face. She looked up as I entered, her smile widening. "Trevor, look," she said, her voice filled with a gentle pride. "The little one is getting its first candle. I thought we might lose it over the winter." I looked at the tiny tree, no taller than my hand, and then at my mother's face, illuminated by the soft, diffused light of the greenhouse. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, were steady as she worked. This place, this small glass room, was the most important thing in her world. Later that evening, she found the letter on the counter where I'd left it. I was in my office and heard a small, sharp intake of breath from the kitchen. I walked in to find her standing there, the formal notice trembling in her hand. The color had drained from her face. "They're going to make you tear it down," she whispered, her voice fragile. "Because of me." "No." "Mom," I said, taking the letter from her and setting it aside. My voice was firm, more confident than I felt. "It's a disagreement over the rules. It's just paperwork. I'm going to handle it." She looked past me, through the window to the greenhouse, its silhouette dark against the evening sky. It's been so good to be in there. Trevor, it's the only place I feel." She trailed off, unable to find the word. "I know," I said softly, "and you're going to keep feeling that way. I promise." As I helped her to her room, I felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. This was no longer a procedural dispute or a battle of wills with an overbearing HOA president. This was about protecting my family. Margaret Whitfield had threatened my mother's peace. She had made it personal, and she had no idea who she was dealing with. My first step was to follow protocol. An aggressive, frontal assault would only alienate my neighbors and give Margaret ammunition to paint me as a litigious bully. I had to win by the rules, their rules. I spent the weekend drafting a formal, detailed appeal of the committee's decision. It was a work of art, a 20-page document complete with architectural diagrams, a copy of the city permit, a detailed analysis of the relevant CC&R clauses, precedents of other, unenforced architectural modifications in the neighborhood, including a rather garish tiki bar I'd photographed from the street, and a polite but firm rebuttal of the view corridor easement claim, citing the lack of any such restriction on my property's deed. I sent it via registered mail to the HOA board and their management company, creating an official paper trail. This led, predictably, to the ACC hearing I'd walked into at the beginning of this story, the one where my meticulously prepared appeal was dismissed out of hand in under 5 minutes. Walking out of that hearing, the sting of public defeat was sharp, but underneath it was a cold clarity. The system wasn't just biased, it was a tool, an instrument of Margaret's will. My appeal was never meant to be read, only rejected. The hearing was a formality, a piece of procedural theater designed to legitimize a decision that had been made long before I stepped up to the podium. The first fine notice arrived in the mail 3 days later. A crisp, computer-generated invoice for $100. The clock was officially ticking. It was time to stop playing defense. My sister, Sarah, answered the phone on the second ring. "Assistant Attorney General Mackenzie," she said, her voice laced with her usual affectionate sarcasm. "To what do I owe the honor? Did you finally decide to prosecute someone for wearing socks with sandals?" Sarah was a local investigative journalist, sharp and cynical, with a reporter's instinct for finding the weak point in any story. She was also the only person in my life, aside from my mother, who knew the quiet, methodical person I was behind the formal title. "I need some advice," I said, and proceeded to lay out the entire saga, from the greenhouse to the hearing to the easement. She listened patiently, the silence on her end broken only by the faint tapping of a keyboard. "Okay, so let me get this straight," she said when I'd finished. "The HOA Queen is using an obscure, possibly non-existent easement to force you to tear down a greenhouse you built for Mom, who she can clearly see is frail. This isn't about property values, Trev. This is a power play. She's trying to make an example of you, because you won't kiss the ring." "I know," I said, "but I need to prove it. And I need to find out what this easement is really about." "Public records. Little brother," she said, her voice shifting into professional mode. "Everything is a record somewhere. County Recorder's Office. You need the original plat maps for the entire Pinterest development. Not the pretty, sanitized version from the sales office, but the dusty, coffee-stained master plans. You also need the title history for your lot and for hers. And while you're at it, pull the records for every property on that ridge. See who this easement actually benefits." Her advice was a spark in the dark. I was so used to dealing with corporate filings and financial statements that I had overlooked the most fundamental documents of all the ones buried in the earth of the land itself. "One more thing," she added, her tone softening. "Don't let this get to you. Remember why you're doing this. This is about Mom's garden, not your ego. Keep your eye on the ball." My next step was to find a guide, someone who knew the local terrain. I thought of Mr. Henderson, the man from the hearing with the fence, but he seemed too cowed by Margaret's authority. Then I remembered another quiet resident, a man I'd often seen meticulously tending his own property a few streets over. His name was David Chen, a retired surveyor who had cultivated a stunning Zen garden in his front yard, a masterpiece of raked gravel, moss-covered stones, and exquisitely pruned Japanese maples. It was a work of art, and I knew, from a passing mention in Margaret's newsletter, that she absolutely hated it, calling it aesthetically non-compliant. I found Mr. Chen raking the gravel into perfect, concentric circles. He was a man of few words, his movements precise and economical. I introduced myself and explained my situation. He listened without expression, his eyes fixed on his work. "I am aware of your difficulty, Mr. Mackenzie," he said, his voice a low, careful rumble. He didn't stop raking. "I received a notice last week. The river stones I have used are not from the approved list of landscaping materials. I have been instructed to replace them with common area-compliant mulch." He paused and looked at me, a flicker of something not anger, but a deep, weary frustration in his eyes. "I have lived in this house for 20 years. I laid these stones before Margaret Whitfield was ever on the board. But the rules," she says, "are the rules. I need help. Mr. Chen," I said, "professional help. I need someone who can read a plat map and understand a legal description better than anyone else. I need to know everything there is to know about this view corridor easement." I handed him a check. "I want to hire you." He looked at the check, then back at me. He stopped raking. For a long moment, he was silent. Then, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will not take your money, Mr. Mackenzie. But I will look at the maps. A man's garden is his own affair." While Mr. Chen began his archival deep dive, I initiated my own procedural assault. I drafted a formal, legally precise records request, citing state statutes governing homeowners associations, and sent it to the HOA's management company. I demanded copies of the past 5 years of board meeting minutes, all financial statements, budgets, vendor contracts, and any and all correspondence related to the enforcement of architectural standards. The response was telling. A week later, I received a thick package. The financial statements were there, but they were high-level summaries, lacking the detailed vendor invoices I had requested. The contracts were heavily redacted, and the meeting minutes were a sea of black ink. Entire sections, particularly from closed-door executive sessions, were completely obscured. I held one page up to the light. The black lines were thick and absolute, a clear statement of concealment. They were hiding something. Margaret was hiding something. 2 weeks into the investigation, Mr. Chen called me. There was a quiet urgency in his voice. "I believe you should come see this. Mr. Mackenzie." I went to his house. The dining room table was covered with enormous, brittle documents, the original plat maps of Pinterest Heights, unrolled and weighted down at the corners with books. They were beautiful, hand-drawn artifacts, crisscrossed with the fine, spidery lines of a surveyor's pen. Mr. Chen pointed to a faintly dotted line that snaked across the upper portion of the development. "Here it is," he said. "The view corridor easement. It's real. It was part of the original master plan." My heart sank. "But," he continued, tapping a long, elegant finger on my lot, "number 814 at the bottom of the slope. The legal description is peculiar. It is defined not by a fixed boundary, but by a line of sight, and it has never, in the 20 years I have lived here, been enforced. Look." He pointed to 3 other properties that were technically, and far more egregiously, encroaching on the easement's airspace. One had a massive brick chimney, another a second-story addition, and a third, a cluster of 50-foot pine trees that had been planted 15 years ago. None of them had ever received a violation notice. "It's selective enforcement," I murmured, the legal term coming to my lips. It was a strong argument, but hard to prove. "That is the small story," Mr. Chen said, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery. "Here is the large one." He moved to another map, this one showing the property lines on the ridge. He pointed to the houses that benefited from the easement, 5 multi-million-dollar properties, including Margaret Whitfield's. But his finger didn't stop there. It traced the line of the easement to the one parcel of land it seemed designed to protect above all others. An empty, undeveloped lot, sitting adjacent to Margaret's own home, possessing the most pristine, unobstructed view in the entire community. "This lot," Mr. Chen said softly, "is the primary beneficiary. Any structure on your property, Mr. Mackenzie, directly impacts the development potential of this specific piece of land." He then slid a sheaf of papers across the table, printouts from the county's property database. I pulled the title history. For 30 years. This lot was owned by the original developer, but 6 months ago, just before you moved in, it was sold. He tapped the final page. It was a deed transfer. The buyer was not a person, but a corporation, a limited liability company. I had never heard of Pinterest Development LLC. A cold dread, mingled with a hunter's thrill, washed over me. I took out my phone and, using the state's business entity search portal, I looked up the company. It had been formed only 7 months prior. There was only one name listed on the public filing. The registered agent, Mark Gable. "Sarah," I said, my voice low, "do you know the name of Margaret Whitfield's husband?" "Stephen Whitfield. She told me once during a conversation about the neighborhood. Her maiden name was Gable." "Mark Gable, her brother-in-law." The pieces clicked into place with the force of a slammed door. This wasn't just a power play. This wasn't just about making an example of me. This was about money. Margaret was using her position as HOA president to clear the view for an undeveloped lot secretly controlled by her family. She wasn't just protecting property values. She was actively, and unethically, trying to inflate the value of her own covert investment before a major development deal. My mother's greenhouse wasn't an eyesore. It was an obstacle to her payday. The knowledge of Margaret's motive changed the texture of the conflict. It was no longer a war of attrition fought with bylaws and appeals. It was a targeted investigation. But as I began to dig deeper, Margaret, sensing a shift in the currents, escalated her campaign. The management company must have informed her of my records request and Mr. Chen's inquiries at the county office. Her retaliation was swift and brutal. The next official letter I received was not a mere fine notice. It was a formal intent to place a property lien, sent by the HOA's attorneys. The language was dense and threatening. It stated that due to my failure to cure the violation, my accumulated fines, now nearing $2,000 plus legal fees, could be secured by placing a lien on my home. A lien was a serious financial weapon. It would cripple my credit score, prevent me from refinancing, and make it nearly impossible to sell the property until the debt was satisfied. It was the HOA equivalent of a nuclear option, a clear signal that she was prepared to scorch the earth to win. Simultaneously, she launched a whisper campaign. I felt it in the subtle shifts in the neighborhood's atmosphere. The friendly waves from neighbors became hesitant, then stopped altogether. The casual chat with the woman next door as we both got our mail was replaced by a hurried nod and a quick retreat into her house. At the community pool, I overheard a snippet of conversation. Heard he's suing the HOA, trying to get out of following the rules like the rest of us. Then came the email. A copy was forwarded to me by a sympathetic neighbor who was growing tired of Margaret's antics. It was from Margaret's official HOA president account, sent to the entire community. It was a masterwork of insinuation and veiled accusation. Dear neighbors, it began. It has come to my attention that there is some misinformation circulating regarding the board's recent efforts to uphold our community's foundational covenants. Please be assured that every action taken is to protect the shared investment we all hold dear. Unfortunately, a new resident has chosen to challenge these long-standing rules through aggressive legal tactics, rather than through community-minded cooperation. This litigious approach threatens to drain our community's financial resources and undermine the very standards that make Pinehurst Heights such a desirable place to live. We must stand united against those who would seek to weaken our community from within for their own personal gain. She had painted me as the enemy, the wealthy, arrogant outsider trying to bully the neighborhood into submission. The isolation was a palpable, corrosive force. My quiet, peaceful sanctuary had become a hostile territory. Even my mother felt it. Mrs. Henderson closed her blinds when I waved to her this morning. She told me, her voice small, "I think people are angry with us." The pressure was immense. The fines were piling up. The lien was a real threat. My neighbors viewed me with suspicion and resentment. I was completely alone. But I had one thing: Margaret didn't count on the truth, and I had a plan to reveal it. The annual homeowners meeting was in 10 days. It would be my stage. The night of the annual meeting. The community hall was packed. This wasn't a sleepy committee meeting. This was the main event. The one time all year that the homeowners gathered to elect board members and vote on the budget. The air was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. Margaret was in her element, presiding over the meeting from the head table on the stage, a picture of poised, benevolent authority. The agenda was tightly controlled. At the entrance, a sign-up sheet for the open forum section had been posted. Speakers were allotted a strict 3-minute time limit, a rule Margaret had instituted years ago to stifle dissent. Beside the podium, a large digital clock was projected onto the screen, its green numbers a stark reminder of the fleeting window for speech. I sat in the back row, my laptop connected to the hall's projector. On my screen was a simple, 3-slide presentation. As I waited, I reviewed my evidence, tucked away in the HOA's financial records. I had found something else, a secondary piece of information that had given me pause. It was a record of a fine levied against Evelyn Rhodes, the quiet board secretary, for replacing her mailbox without prior approval. The fine was significant, $500. But next to it was a notation waived by presidential discretion, MW. It was a small, ugly piece of data. Margaret had likely waived the fine to ensure Evelyn's loyalty, to keep her compliant and silent. For a moment, I considered adding it to my presentation as a fourth exhibit. It would be a killing blow, proof of her hypocrisy and manipulation, a way to demonstrate that even the board members were not immune to her tactics of control. It would utterly destroy her credibility, but it would also humiliate Evelyn, a woman who, while weak, did not seem malicious. It would alienate the one person on the board who had shown even a flicker of reluctance to follow Margaret's lead. I looked over at the board table. Evelyn was staring down at her notes, her shoulders slumped. She looked tired, trapped. Exposing her felt wrong. My fight was with Margaret, not with her collateral damage. My case was strong enough without it. Using Evelyn's minor infraction to score points felt like a betrayal of the very principles I was fighting for. I deleted the file from my desktop. I would win this the right way. Or not at all. Finally, after an hour of budgetary reports and committee updates, Margaret announced, "We will now move to the open forum. First speaker is Trevor Mackenzie." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I walked to the podium, the click of my dress shoes echoing in the tense silence. I placed my laptop on the lectern and looked out at the faces of my neighbors. They were wary, hostile, convinced I was the villain of this story. "Good evening," I said, my voice calm and steady. Margaret started the clock. The numbers 300 glowed on the screen beside my head. "My name is Trevor Mackenzie, and I live at 814 Oakmont Drive. I am not here tonight to argue about my greenhouse. I am here to talk about our rules and how they are being applied. I have 3 pieces of evidence I would like to show you." With a click of the mouse, the first slide appeared on the screen. Exhibit A. "This," I said, as a high-resolution image of the official Pinehurst Heights plat map filled the screen, "is the view corridor easement that has been cited as the reason for the violation against my property." My cursor highlighted the faint, dotted line. As you can see, it is a poorly defined, 60-year-old restriction. More importantly, it has been selectively enforced. These properties here, I circled 3 other homes, all contain structures that have encroached on this easement for years, without any action from the board. This is a documented pattern of non-enforcement, which legally invalidates its application in my case. The clock ticked past 2:00. A few people in the audience were leaning forward now, their expressions shifting from hostility to curiosity. I clicked to the next slide, Exhibit B. After my appeal was denied, I made a formal request for the HOA's meeting minutes. The documents I received were heavily redacted. However, under state law, I was able to appeal that redaction. This is a page from the unredacted minutes of an executive session held 6 months ago. The text on the screen was clear. Motion by M. Whitfield to direct the ACC to begin a process of clarifying and enforcing historic easements. Effective immediately. Motion is seconded and passes. At this meeting, I explained, my voice level. Our HOA president pushed through a resolution to begin enforcing this dormant easement. What the minutes do not show is any disclosure of a conflict of interest, which brings me to my final exhibit. The clock showed 1:0. Margaret's face was a stony mask, but I could see a tick in her jaw. I clicked to the final slide, Exhibit C. It showed two documents side by side. The primary beneficiary of this easement is this single, undeveloped lot, adjacent to Ms. Whitfield's property. My cursor circled the parcel on the map. 6 months ago, that lot was sold to a shell corporation called Pinehurst Development LLC. On the right is the official state corporation filing for that LLC. The registered agent is a man named Mark Gable, Margaret Whitfield's brother-in-law. A collective gasp went through the room. It was sharp and audible. The enforcement of this easement is not about protecting community views. It is about increasing the development value of a property secretly controlled by our president's family. And this enforcement was not just general policy. I made one final click, and a new image replaced the LLC, filing a copy of an email. This is an email I obtained through my records request, from Ms. Whitfield to the management company. Dated the week after my greenhouse was completed. It reads, "Please begin enforcement of the Pinehurst View Corridor easement with prejudice, starting with 814 Oakmont Drive." I let the words hang in the air. I am not accusing anyone of a crime. I am simply presenting the facts. The actions taken against my property were not the result of neutral rules enforcement. They were the result of a targeted campaign, motivated by an undisclosed financial conflict of interest, in direct violation of our own HOA bylaws. Section 3.1.5, which governs board member conduct. I looked up at the clock. It read 0:15. "My time is up, thank you." I sat down. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, profound silence. The sound of 100 minds processing a fundamental shift in their reality. Every eye was on Margaret. Her face, which had been a mask of control, was now pale and ashen. The carefully constructed artifice of her authority had been dismantled, piece by piece, in under 3 minutes. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, a single, quavering voice broke it. "I would like to make a motion." All heads turned. It was Evelyn Rhodes, the board secretary. She was standing, her small frame trembling slightly, but her eyes were clear and resolute. She held a copy of the bylaws in her hand, her finger marking a page. "According to Section 4.2 of the Pinehurst Heights bylaws," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word, "the membership may, upon presentation of evidence of gross mismanagement or malfeasance, vote to take immediate corrective action. I move that the board immediately suspend any and all fines and liens related to the enforcement of the View Corridor easement, pending a full and independent review. Furthermore, I move that we commission an independent, third-party forensic audit of the last 3 years of this association's financials, contracts, and executive decisions." A man from the front row jumped to his feet. "I second that motion." Margaret, jolted from her stupor, banged her gavel. "This is out of order. There is no such motion on the agenda." But it was too late. Her power, built on procedure and intimidation, had vanished. The crowd was no longer hers. "All in favor," someone shouted from the back. A forest of hands shot up across the room. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave of dissent. Arthur Henderson's hand was first and highest. Mr. Chen's was raised in a quiet, firm salute. "All opposed?" Evelyn asked, her gaze fixed on Margaret. Only 2 hands went up. Margaret's 2 cronies on the board. Margaret herself sat frozen, her hand hovering over the table, seemingly unable to act. "The motion passes," Evelyn declared into the stunned silence. Her voice didn't hold triumph, only a profound, weary relief. Margaret Whitfield simply sat there, a queen on a dismantled throne, the echo of her gavel a distant memory. 3 months later, the autumn sun streamed into my mother's greenhouse. She sat in her comfortable chair, a look of deep contentment on her face, trimming a small Japanese maple whose leaves had turned a fiery, brilliant crimson. The peace of our home had been restored. The forensic audit had been devastating. It had uncovered years of financial misconduct. From falsified vendor invoices for aesthetic compliance consultants, a company owned by Margaret's sister, to the embezzlement of reserve funds for landscaping improvements that only ever occurred on her own property. The management company, complicit in the cover-up, was fired. A special election was held, and an entirely new, resident-led board was seated. Mr. Chen was its president. Margaret and her 2 loyal board members had resigned in disgrace the week after the annual meeting. They, along with her brother-in-law, were now the defendants in a significant civil lawsuit filed by the new HOA board to recover the misappropriated funds. The state's Attorney General's office, tipped off by an anonymous but very detailed complaint, had opened its own investigation into potential criminal fraud charges. My lien had been expunged from the records, and the new Architectural Control Committee, chaired by a reasonable landscape architect, had retroactively approved my greenhouse with a polite, one-sentence letter. That afternoon, as I was bringing in the mail, I found a small, plain envelope tucked inside my screen door. There was no stamp, no return address. Inside was a simple, handwritten note. Mr. Mackenzie, thank you. You gave us our neighborhood back. It was signed by Arthur Henderson. Tucked behind the note was a proxy form for the recent emergency board election. It granted me the authority to cast a vote on his family's behalf. Below his signature were 6 others, the names of families on my street and beyond who had, for years, been quietly weathering Margaret's storm. I looked from the note in my hand to the greenhouse, where my mother was humming softly to herself. I had come to Pinterest Heights seeking quiet anonymity. I had not wanted to be a leader or a crusader, but in fighting to protect my small corner of the world, I had inadvertently helped my neighbors reclaim theirs. The fight had not just been won, the community had been restored.